Welcome back to Hexes, Haunts, and Howls. I'm your host, Cupcake. Today is episode 2 of Stars, Stripes, and Secrets, a series where we dive into leaked government documents and classified mysteries. Today's episode is different from many of the stories we tell here. There is no legends in this one, no creatures in the dark. What we're talking about today is real, documented, and still deeply unsettling. Not because it's mysterious, but because it happened to real people. Today, we're talking about MKUltra. Before we begin, I want to be clear about something. This episode is not here to shock you. It's not here to sensationalize suffering or to turn trauma into entertainment. This is a story about trust, and what happens when trust is broken in the name of fear, power, and secrecy. MKUltra was a covert program run by the CIA from the early 1950s through the early 1970s. It involved experiments on the human mind, many of them carried out without consent, without transparency, and without regard for the long-term consequences of the people involved. Some of the individuals affected were patients. Some were prisoners. Some were soldiers. Some were simply people who trusted doctors, institutions, and their government to do no harm. Many of them never knew what was done to them. Some never fully recovered. Some never got answers. So before we go any further, here's a gentle content note. This episode includes discussions of psychological experimentation, non-consensual drug use, emotional trauma, and death. There will be no graphic descriptions, but the subject matter itself can be heavy. Please take care of yourself while listening. It's okay to pause. It's okay to step away. It's okay to come back later, or not at all. I also want to acknowledge something else. When we talk about government projects like this, it's easy to let them become abstract. Acronyms, dates, files, declassified paperwork. But behind every document was a person with a body, a nervous system, a life outside the experiment. A person who felt fear, confusion, betrayal, and in many cases, lasting harm. This episode is told with them in mind. It's also told as a reminder of something broader. That progress without ethics is not progress at all. That secrecy without accountability corrodes institutions. And that fear, especially on a national scale, can convince people to justify things they would never accept in the light. There's another quiet layer to this story too, one we don't talk about often. When chemicals are tested without care, when waste is discarded without thought, when experimentation ignores consequences, the harm doesn't stop with people. It reaches outwards, into communities, into families, and into the environment itself, into water, land, and places that never consented either. MKUltra didn't just alter minds. It left marks that spread. As we move through this episode, I won't ask you to jump to conclusions. I won't ask you to distrust anything or to live in suspicion. What I will ask is something simpler but harder. To listen with empathy. to remember that history isn't distant, and to hold space for the idea that acknowledging harm is the first step towards not repeating it. This is MKUltra, not as a conspiracy, but as a confirmed chapter in history. A chapter that asks us who we protect, who we sacrifice, and who gets to decide the difference. Take a breath. We'll begin at the beginning. To understand how a program like MKUltra could exist at all, we have to take a step back, not just into history, but into mindset. The Cold War wasn't defined by constant fighting. It was defined by constant anticipation. In the years after World War II, the United States was living with a new kind of fear. Not an enemy you can see on a battlefield, but one that might already be inside the country, inside institutions, inside ideas, inside people. The Soviet Union wasn't just seen as a military threat. It was framed as an ideological one. The fear wasn't only about bombs and borders. It was about the control of thought. And when fear shifts from physical danger to psychological danger, the rules change. During this time, reports began circulating that American prisoners of war in Korea had been brainwashed, that they had been manipulated into confessing crimes, renouncing their country, or cooperating with the enemy. Whether those reports were exaggerated or misunderstood mattered less than how they were received. Because fear doesn't wait for clarity. Fear moves faster than facts. Fear fills in gaps with worst-case scenarios. And fear, when combined with power, starts to look for shortcuts. The question quietly forming inside intelligence agencies wasn't, is this happening? It was, what if it is, and we're not prepared? And that, what if, became a justification. This is where the psychology of control enters the story. When institutes feel threatened, they often stop thinking in terms of individuals. People become variables, test cases, means to an end. Harm becomes something that can be outsourced, rationalized, or hidden behind language that sounds scientific instead of moral. Words like subjects, assets, acceptable risk. Those words create distance, and distance makes things easier to do. There's a deeply human tendency, especially under stress, to believe that extreme circumstances demand extreme measures, that the rules don't apply when survival feels at stake, that temporary harm is justified if it prevents a greater catastrophe. But here's the quiet danger in that thinking. Once harm is justified in theory, it becomes easier to practice. The Cold War was an era where secrecy wasn't just common. It was celebrated. Classified information meant safety. Silence meant loyalty. Questioning authority could be framed as weakness, or worse, as betrayal. In that environment, oversight erodes. And without oversight, fear starts making decisions unchecked. Psychologists and intelligence officials began asking unsettling questions. Could the human mind be broken down and rebuilt? Could memory be erased? Could loyalty be altered? Could identity itself be disrupted and reshaped. These weren't questions being asked out of curiosity. They were being asked out of panic. And panic has a way of shrinking moral imagination. When you're afraid, your circle of concern tightens. You protect what's inside the circle, and everything outside becomes expendable. That's how harm becomes invisible to the people ordering it. This isn't unique to the Cold War. It's a pattern. We see it anytime fear is allowed to override empathy. Anytime safety is defined so narrowly that it excludes humanity. There's another layer to this, one that's uncomfortable to admit. Control is seductive. The idea that chaos can be managed, that uncertainty can be eliminated, that human behavior can be predicted and shaped. It offers relief to anxious systems. Control promises safety. Control promises certainty. But control also requires dominance. And dominance rarely stops at theory. During the Cold War, science and power became deeply intertwined. Research fundings flowed toward projects that promised advantage, not healing. Discovery wasn't just about understanding the mind. It was about owning it. And when science is stripped of ethics, it stops asking whether it should and focuses on whether it can. The fear of being controlled by an enemy led to an obsession with learning how to control others first. That irony sits at the heart of MKUltra. Because in trying to prevent imagined atrocities, real ones were committed. What's important to understand here is that most of the people involved didn't wake up thinking, I'm going to hurt someone today. Harm didn't enter loudly. It entered quietly through paperwork, approvals, funding, and institutional momentum. Through people telling themselves, this is necessary, this is temporary, this is for the greater good. Fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like calm, rational decision-making that's lost its moral anchor. And once fear becomes policy, it's hard to stop. This is the emotional soil MKUltra grew in. Not madness, not superstition, but fear, authority, secrecy, and the belief that control could save us. As we move forward, keep this in mind. Because the most unsettling part of this story isn't what was done. It's how reasonable it seemed to the people who authorized it. And that realization asks something of us. Not suspicion, but awareness. An awareness that fear doesn't just threaten safety. It threatens compassion. By the early 1950s, the Central Intelligence Agency was still a young organization. It was formed in 1947, tasked with gathering intelligence, countering foreign threats, and ensuring the United States was prepared for the new global order. One of the questions quietly circulating in leadership circles was simple. How do we gain an advantage over adversaries who might already be exploring the human mind as a weapon? The language in reports and memos was clinical. Behavior engineering, interrogation enhancement, operational control. These terms are sterile, almost mechanical, but what they referred to was profound. The possibility of influencing thought, altering memory, and potentially reshaping loyalty. In 1953, the CIA officially launched MKUltra. The program's stated goal was to research and develop methods of mind control for intelligence purposes. The project itself was not a single laboratory or office. It was a network of sub-projects, at least 149 confirmed, distributed across universities, hospitals, prisons, and private research facilities. Funding was channeling through front organizations, creating layers of separation between the CIA and the researchers. Some projects were approved as behavioral research. Others were framed as studies of psychiatric drugs. In many cases, the true source of funding was hidden from the participants, and sometimes even from the institutions themselves. The CIA approached MKUltra with a strict operational mindset. Efficiency and results were prioritized. Human ethics were documented, but often treated as secondary to the objectives of intelligence advantage. Experiments were divided into categories. Among the most prominent were psychoactive substances, LSD, mescaline, and other drugs were tested for their ability to disrupt cognition, induce compliance, or create suggestibility. Dosages, timing, and administration methods were carefully logged. Hypnosis and suggestion. Researchers investigated whether hypnotic techniques could accelerate learning, extract information, or induce temporary amnesia. Protocols were written, tested, and adjusted with clinical precision. Secondary deprivation and isolation. Time spent in controlled environments with restricted stimuli was systematically measured to determine effects on cognition and psychological resilience. Biological and chemical agents. Certain subprojects explored chemical irritants, paralytics, and other compounds to assess physiological and behavioral response. The CIA's mindset was structured, almost surgical. Researchers reported findings in memos, charts, and graphs. Experiments were designed, executed, and analyzed as if human subjects were variables in a lab equation. Data points, outcomes, successes, failures. It is worth noting again how detached the documents read. Objectives, methods, and results are laid out with minimal emotional language. It's clinical, precise, and methodical. A stark contrast to what these experiments did to the lives of real people. Some memos even include risk assessments, weighing potential gains against the chance of psychological and physical harm. But these risks were largely abstracted. The documents rarely acknowledged the individual who would bear them. The human element was minimized in the pursuit of results. Approval procedures, oversight committees, and the chain of command protocols were established. Reports were written to justify decisions. Meetings were held to determine which subprojects were promising. Budgets were allocated. Timelines were enforced. All in all, The operation was as organized and systematic as any legitimate research enterprise, except that many participants had no idea they were involved, and no consent was ever sought. It is precisely this clinical detachment that allows us to see the full horror of MKUltra later on. Because when the numbers, schedules, and charts are stripped away, we are left with reality. Real human beings subjected to experiments that altered their perception, their memories, and their sense of self. The CIA's mindset was built to prioritize intelligence outcomes over personal welfare. It was structured to reduce moral hesitation. It was designed to treat fear as justification and data as the measure of success. From the outside, reading the memos and funding requests, MKUltra almost appears as an academic or medical project. Charts, statistics, and progress reports make it seem orderly. But the reality behind the pages, behind the cold numbers, was profoundly different. This is what we will explore in the next section. The human cost of these operations, where clinical detachment meant lives, and where the abstract calculations of control became very real suffering. When MKUltra began, one of the most studied tools was a chemical you may have heard of, LSD, or lysergic acid diethylamide. The CIA did not approach it as a recreational substance or even as a medical therapy. They approached it as a potential weapon, a way to disrupt thought, to break resistance, and to control the mind. Documents from the era show that officials believed LSD could make a person reveal secrets they might otherwise keep, become more suggestible to commands or influence, and experience confusion, disorientation, or compliance under pressure. The theory was that a carefully administered dose could reshape behavior in ways that were measurable and, most importantly, controllable. Of course, what the CIA's theories ignored, or intentionally dismissed, were the very human realities of LSD. People react unpredictably to psychoactive substances. Effects are influenced by personality, mental health, environment, and even the expectations set by those administering the drugs. No chart, no laboratory settings, no control could fully account for the chaos inside a human mind. And yet, the experiments continued. LSD was tested in a variety of ways. Sometimes it was slipped into drinks without consent. Sometimes it was given under the guise of medical treatment. Sometimes it was administered to prisoners or hospital patients, people who had no real choice. Researchers meticulously recorded reactions, confusion, paranoia, hallucinations, euphoria, terror. They tracked dosage, timing, and the environment. Memos detailed the successes and failures, the moments when a subject was compliant versus when the reaction was considered a failure. But behind every entry was a real person, a person experiencing intense psychological stress, often alone, with no support and no understanding of why it was happening. And the harm was not always immediate. Many participants experienced lingering effects, persistent anxiety, flashbacks or intrusive thoughts, memory loss or difficulty concentrating, and long-term depression or altered perception of reality. In some cases, these effects lasted decades. In others, lives were irrevocably altered, sometimes ending tragically. The ethical violations of these experiments are undeniable. Consent was often absent. When it existed, it was incomplete, misleading, or coerced. Some participants were told they were taking vitamins or a harmless medication. Others had no say at all. The principle of do no harm, a cornerstone of medicine and research, was set aside. Safety protocols, as we understand them today, were either ignored or considered secondary to operational goals. Pause here and let that sink in. Imagine walking into a clinic or a prison and trusting that those in authority would protect you. Imagine being given a substance that changed your perception, your memories, your ability to reason without warning. Imagine that your suffering would be logged as data points rather than treated as harm. This is what MKUltra did. It's easy to think of LSD as a colorful cultural icon of the 1960s. But in this context, it was something far darker, a tool of control, applied without regard for humanity. The experiments didn't end with a single dose or a single session. Some subjects were repeatedly tested over weeks, months, or even years. Notes show cycles of testing, observation, and reporting, a pattern designed to monitor psychological breakdown, not healing. And the psychological damage often persisted long after these tests concluded. Families would report changes in their loved ones. Former subjects described lasting paranoia, confusion, or emotional fragility. Some were never able to return to their previous life, their previous sense of themselves. This is where the story begins to breathe, where the stark contrast becomes clinical detachment and human cost becomes most apparent. The memos show neat rows of numbers. The reports describe successful compliance. But those numbers were not abstract. They belonged to someone who lived inside them, often without choice. And it was not just LSD. Other chemical experiments involved mescaline, barbiturates, amphetamines, and experimental mixtures designed to disorientate or incapacitate. Each with the same pattern, hypothesis, administration, observation, and documentation, always with human beings as the test apparatus. The lesson here is both simple and devastating. Even under the guise of science, even in the name of national security, the human mind is not a laboratory tool. The story of LSD and MKUltra is a story of trust broken, innocence violated, and lives quietly altered. And as we move forward into the next sections, keep this in mind. The real horror of MKUltra isn't only the drugs themselves. It's the combination of authority, fear, secrecy, and clinical precision applied to human beings, as if morality could be calculated out of existence. Take a breath here. Let the weight of it settle. Because the next chapter will explore another set of experiments: sensory deprivation, isolation, and the psychological manipulation that accompanied these chemical trials. And it is here, in these quieter, controlled spaces, that the human cost becomes even more apparent. Another cornerstone of MKUltra was sensory deprivation, controlled experiments designed to strip away input from the outside world. This wasn't about comfort or therapy. It was about testing limits. How far could a person's mind be pushed before it fractured? How much could perception, memory, and emotion be manipulated when the usual anchors of everyday life were removed? Experiments often involved placing individuals in small, darkened rooms, sometimes with earplugs or blindfolds. Stimuli were minimized: no light, no sound, no interaction. Some sessions lasted hours, others days. Records note attempts to measure psychological and physiological responses: heart rate, stress levels, agitation, suggestibility, as if humans were lab instruments rather than living, breathing people. Many of these experiments were carried out in institutions that carried inherent power imbalances. Prisons, where inmates had no choice. They could not leave. They could not consent. Their participation was mandated, and their suffering became data. Isolation cells became experimental chambers, and the line between punishment and research blurred. Hospitals. Some patients were told they were part of a treatment program or study. In reality, the sensory deprivation tests were designed to observe reactions to disorientation, confusion, and psychological stress. Vulnerable individuals, people already seeking help, were subjected to extreme measures under the guise of care. The intention, according to documents, was to discover what could break resistance or alter behavior. Researchers measured compliance, confusion, hallucinations, and emotional breakdowns. But what the reports did not measure and could not quantify was the long-term toll these interventions took on the human psyche. Because trauma doesn't always appear immediately. Subjects frequently reported lingering anxiety, difficulty trusting authority, depression, nightmares, and a profound sense of disconnection from reality. Some experienced altered sensory perception long after experiments ended. Sound seemed sharper, light seemed harsher, emotions felt unpredictable. Families observed changes in mood, memory, and behavior, often with no explanation. These experiments also exploited the environment of confinement itself. A prison cell, a hospital room, or a research lab may seem neutral on the surface, but within the context of sensory deprivation, they become instruments of control. Physical surroundings were weaponized to manipulate the mind. What makes this part of MKUltra particularly chilling is its subtlety. There were no immediate violence, no overt attack. The harm came in the absence of normal human connection and in the deliberate creation of uncertainty and disorientation. Psychologists now recognize that prolonged isolation can have profound effects on the brain. Increased anxiety, depression, hallucinations, cognitive decline, and emotional instability. MKUltra experiments were designed to exploit exactly those vulnerabilities. Pause here and let that settle. Imagine being in a quiet room for hours, days, maybe even longer. No interaction, no context, no explanation. The body stays alive, but the mind begins to search for meaning. And in that search, the self can start to unravel. This is not speculation. This is well documented psychological trauma, inflicted intentionally. And again, we return to the environments. In prisons, the context compounded the harm. These were already places of stress, punishment, and loss of autonomy. The experiments added an extra layer of psychological assault. In hospitals, people were supposed to be safe. They were supposed to heal. Instead, their trust was violated. Fear and uncertainty were administered alongside substances or protocols designed to disorientate. The consequences were long-lasting. Many subjects never fully regained their baseline sense of safety. Trust in doctors, institutions, or authority figures was eroded permanently. Relationships fractured. Careers and personal lives were affected. Some individuals withdrew entirely, emotionally or socially, unable to reconcile the trauma inflicted in these controlled spaces. MKUltra was not a single act. It was a system. Multiple projects, multiple settings, repeated trials, all designed to explore the boundaries of human cognition and compliance. The human cost is staggering precisely because it is cumulative. Each individual experiment may seem abstract in isolation. A few hours here, a session there. But for those on the receiving end, the psychological weight compounded over time. As we consider sensory deprivation and isolation, it's important to remember the true measure of these experiments is not found in memos or data sheets. It is found in the ongoing lives affected and minds altered, trust broken, and trauma carried for decades. This section, this breathing space, is about acknowledging that weight. Because what comes next is where MKUltra intersects with human identity itself, where manipulation of the mind went beyond chemical and isolation, reaching into memory, behavior, and the core sense of self. Up to this point, we've explored the structure of MKUltra, the chemical experiments, the sensory deprivation. We've seen the programs in abstract, almost clinical terms. Now, we need to take a step back into the reality behind the memos, the charts, and the funding requests. Because the truth is this: MKUltra's subjects were not just data points. They were human beings. And many of them were especially vulnerable. Prisons were one of the primary environments for these experiments. People incarcerated for crimes, sometimes minor, sometimes serious, were treated as ideal candidates. Why? Because the power imbalance was total. Prisoners could not refuse. They could not leave. They were, in the eyes of the program, available, contained, and controllable. What the documents call compliance tests were in reality forced participation, hours in sensory deprivation chambers, doses of psychoactive substances without knowledge, constant observation, the promise of reward or avoidance of punishment might have been used as leverage, but in truth, the choice to say no didn't even exist. These were people already navigating a system designed to punish. The experiments added a layer of psychological violation, eroding agency and trust. Another group exploited were patients seeking help. People who came to hospitals hoping for healing, comfort, or therapy. Instead, some were subjected to experimental protocols. They were administered chemicals, hypnotic procedures, or isolation without informed consent. Imagine being vulnerable in a place that is supposed to protect you. Imagine believing someone is there to help, only to realize, perhaps too late, that your mind itself is the object of study. The betrayal is profound. Medical ethics were ignored. Trust, a fundamental human need, was stripped away in the name of research. It wasn't limited to hospitals. Some subjects came forward voluntarily, seeking therapy, guidance, or assistance for psychological or medical issues, and were unknowingly enrolled in experiments. These were people who had already made themselves vulnerable, hoping for relief from suffering. Their willingness to trust was used against them. And yet, in reading accounts and surviving records, it's clear they were treated as opportunities for data collection, not as humans deserving care. Across all groups, a common thread is coercion. Some subjects had no legal ability to consent. Some were misled. Some were pressured by authority figures. The power imbalance was systematic. It was institutional. And that is what makes MKUltra particularly harrowing. Because the harm was not just in the experiments themselves. It was in the denial of choice, the removal of autonomy, and the silencing of agency. Think of a person stripped of choice, subjected to substances and conditions they cannot control. Think of the fear, the confusion, the disorientation that would accompany this. These were not extraordinary people. They were not superhuman or particularly strong. They were ordinary humans, navigating extraordinary violations. And the long-term consequences were profound. Many former subjects carried trauma for decades. Some struggled with anxiety, depression, hallucinations, or memory issues. Some withdrew from relationships, never fully regaining trust in institutions or authority. Families also bore the weight. Loved ones noticed changes, sometimes subtle, sometimes devastating. Spouses, children, parents, they watched someone they cared for become a shadow of themselves. And yet, so few ever received acknowledgement. Few were ever given explanations. Even fewer received apologies. This is the section where compassion matters most.
Because it's not abstract. It's not just history on paper. These were people who mattered, and whose suffering was considered secondary to research outcomes. MKUltra did not create monsters. It manipulated ordinary humans, taking advantage of circumstances, authority, and fear. And in recognizing that, we honor the victims. We name them, not individually, because most are lost to history, but collectively, as humans who were treated as expendable. This reflection is necessary. It is the moral counterbalance to the clinical tone we explored earlier. Because without empathy, without acknowledgement of suffering, the lessons of MKUltra cannot fully land. In the story of MKUltra, few individuals are as emblematic of the human cost as Frank Olson. He was a scientist, a biochemist, someone who had dedicated his life to research, to understanding, to discovery. A man with a family, responsibilities, friends, and a life beyond the laboratory. In 1953, Olson began working with the CIA on biological warfare research. He was involved in experiments that, on paper, were designed to keep the country safe. In reality, they were part of a larger network of secret programs, MKUltra among them, that often tested chemicals and psychological methods on unsuspecting participants. In 1953, Olson was unknowingly administered LSD. Documents indicate he had no idea what was happening. No consent was obtained, and no support was offered. The effects on his mind and body were profound. Reports suggest extreme disorientation, anxiety, and paranoia. Exactly the kind of response MKUltra sought to study. A week later, Frank Olson died after falling from a hotel window in New York City. Initially, his death was labeled a suicide. For decades, the circumstances surrounding it were unclear, and for his family, the lack of transparency was devastating. This is not a story about conspiracy or hidden villains. This is a story about a family left without peace. Olson's widow, his children, his friends, spent years searching for answers. They had to confront a reality in which a loved one's life had been altered and ultimately ended by secret experiments conducted in the name of national security. They faced institutions that were slow to acknowledge wrongdoing, slow to release information, and often silent when clarity was needed most. Imagine what that must feel like. Imagine grieving someone whose death is surrounded by unanswered questions. Imagine learning that their mind had been manipulated, that their body had been used as a test subject, and that the full truth might never come. The family eventually uncovered some of the facts. Lawsuits were filed. Some acknowledgement and financial compensation were offered. But these measures could never restore what was lost: the sense of security, the trust in institutions, the life that might have continued. This story also reminds us of the ordinary humanity for those involved. Frank Olson was not an abstract figure. He was a father, a husband, a colleague, and a neighbor. His work was meant to serve the public good. And yet, in the machinery of MKUltra, he became a subject of the very experiments he might have been studying professionally. It is important to tell this gently. There is no need for exaggeration. The tragedy is real enough. The grief, unresolved and heavy, speaks for itself. Because Frank Olson's story is also a lens for understanding MKUltra as a whole. Behind every memo, every report, every chart, there were real lives. Some altered forever, some lost entirely. And what remains for decades is the family left to reckon with absence and uncertainty, to seek answers where transparency was withheld, to grieve in the shadow of secrecy. In remembering Frank Olson, we honor the human cost of secrecy and fear. We see how decisions made in the abstract, in offices, in meetings, and laboratory notes, ripple outward to touch the lives in profound, irreversible ways. This section is less about intrigue and more about empathy, less about speculation and more about acknowledgement. As we move forward in the story, we will explore the broader aftermath of MKUltra, what the government eventually disclosed, what justice or acknowledgement was offered, and how history remembers or fails to remember the people affected. But for now, take a moment to hold the weight of this loss. Take a breath. Consider the ordinary man caught in extraordinary circumstances. The family left in a quiet grief. And the reminder that behind every historical fact, there is a human story, fragile, complex, and deserving of care. As we take a step back from the personal stories, it's worth noticing that MKUltra's reach extended beyond the human mind. Experiments didn't exist in a vacuum. Chemicals were handled, stored, and sometimes discarded with little oversight. Laboratories and faculties released substances into waste systems. Records suggest that some compounds were not fully contained, creating risks for communities and environments. It's a quiet kind of harm, subtle but real. The land, the water, the spaces around the labs became collateral. The consequences were often invisible, and yet they persist, reminders that ethical negligence rarely stops with one target. Institutionally, MKUltra left scars as well. It relied on secrecy, bureaucracy, and a culture that minimized accountability. Those systems, once used to justify experiments on unwilling participants, also eroded trust. Institutions designed to protect people became mechanisms of control. Oversight was weak. Transparency was limited. The very structures that should have safeguarded ethics failed. This section isn't about dramatic events. It's about quiet, systemic impact. Harm that spreads outward, touching humans, communities, and the natural world in ways that are often unseen but enduring. The lesson is simple but profound. When authority and secrecy are prioritized over ethics, the damage is not confined to the lab or the prison. It radiates outward to people, to families, and to the world around them. Even after decades, these echoes remain. They are reminders that responsibility is never just about immediate actions, but about the systems we create and the care we choose to extend or withhold. One of the most haunting aspects of MKUltra is not what was done in the moment. It was what was deliberately erased. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MKUltra files. Thousands of documents, reports, and memos, records of experiments, subjects, procedures, and findings were shredded, incinerated, or otherwise eliminated. Years of research, lives altered, families affected, and the evidence of it almost entirely gone. The human cost was real. The data was removed. The memory of the events nearly buried. What survived are fragments, a handful of memos, partial reports, and some declassified sub-project summaries. From these remnants, historians and journalists have been able to piece together part of the story, but much will never be known. The destruction of records was not just protecting national security. It was also concealing wrongdoing. In eliminating the paperwork, the CIA minimized accountability. Oversight committees, ethical boards, and even other branches of government had less opportunity to intervene or question. And so the truth became difficult to assess. Survivors struggled to tell their stories. Families waited decades for acknowledgement. Researchers pieced together fragments, often in frustration and uncertainty. Silence in this context is meaningful. It represents the absence left behind. The voices that were never recorded. The experiences that may never be fully known. And the accountability that was delayed or denied. Even today, the gaps in the historical record leave us with only partial clarity. The destruction of documents reminds us of the fragility of memory and the importance of transparency. There is a lesson here, quiet but profound. History can be erased, but human impact cannot. Lives were affected. Families grieved. Minds were altered. And even when the official record disappears, the consequences remain. The surviving fragments allow us to learn, to reflect, and to bear witness. But they also serve as a caution. Secrecy and destruction do not undo harm. They only prolong its shadow. As we move forward to the aftermath of MKUltra, remember this silence. Let it remind us that while documents can be destroyed, the human experience of suffering and loss persists. MKUltra did not end quietly. Its existence became public in the 1970s after a series of congressional hearings and investigations brought fragments of the truth to light. These hearings revealed what had been done and to whom. Survivors and families testified. Researchers and whistleblowers spoke. Yet even as the program was exposed, accountability was limited. Few of the officials who authorized or oversaw the experiments were held responsible. Few of the institutions that facilitated harm faced serious consequences. What accountability should have looked like is clear. It would have meant acknowledgement, a full public admission of harm done, not just to the individuals directly experimented upon, but to the families, communities, and institutions affected. Restitution, compensation, and support for the survivors, medical, psychological, and social, to help restore as much as possible what had been disrupted. Institutional reform, changes in policy, oversight, and ethics to ensure that no one could be subjected to harm under secrecy again. Cultural reckoning, a public experiment of how fear and secrecy can justify unethical behavior so that history's lessons are truly learned. Instead, the response was partial, delayed, and procedural. A handful of survivors received settlements. Reports were published. Policies were adjusted. But the broader reckoning, the moral acknowledgement of what was done, and the deep harm inflicted, was largely absent. This is why MKUltra continues to resonate today. It's a reminder that secrecy and authority, unchecked, can lead to profound ethical violations. That fear, when allowed to override empathy, can create systems in which ordinary people are treated as expendable. And it is a reminder that accountability is not just a bureaucratic process. It is a moral responsibility. It is the recognition that every life matters. That harm cannot simply be erased by documents shredded or memos destroyed. As we reflect on the aftermath, it's not to dwell in anger, nor to sensationalize suffering. It's to consider what justice looks like. and how we might ensure that institutions meant to protect never lose sight of the humanity they serve. Accountability is about more than punishment. It is about acknowledgement, repair, and prevention. And in the case of MKUltra, that moral reckoning remains, in many ways, unfinished. As we reach the end of this episode, it's time to take a step back and reflect, not on the charts, the memos, or the experiments themselves, but on the lessons that remain. MKUltra was, at its core, a story about control without consent, about authority exercised without care, about curiosity, science, and fear applied in ways that overlooked the most essential truth. The human being is not an object. A life is not a laboratory. And trust, once broken, can take a lifetime to repair. Consent. The simple ability to say yes or no is foundational. It is what protects us from harm and what honors our autonomy. MKUltra reminds us that when consent is stripped away, even under the guise of national security or scientific exploration, the consequences are profound and lasting. Care is another lesson. Care for individuals, care for communities, care for the environments around us. MKUltra was not just a failure of ethics. It was a failure of care. And the echoes of that failure ripple outward into families, institutions, and the natural world. Memory is the third pillar, not just remembering history, but remembering the people who lived it. The scientists who were coerced, the patients who were deceived, and the families who were left in uncertainty. Memory preserves accountability, compassion, and empathy. It allows us to honor those who suffered, to learn from what went wrong, and to ensure that simple mistakes are never repeated. As we carry this story forward, we don't do so to dwell in fear or guilt. We carry it forward to shape how we act today, how we make choices in positions of power, how we care for those who trust us, how we preserve consent, uphold ethics, and protect human dignity in research, in government, and in daily life. MKUltra is a stark reminder that secrecy, fear, and authority, when unchecked, can create harm that lasts far beyond the laboratory or the moment of action. But it also is a reminder of the resilience of those who survived and of the families who never stopped seeking answers, justice, or acknowledgement. We carry their stories forward, not as statistics, not as footnotes, but as reminders of what is meant to be human, to make mistakes, to seek justice, to recognize harm, and to commit to care, accountability, and empathy. Let this reflection settle. Take a deep breath. Hold space for the weight of what we've explored, the lives affected, the mistakes made, and the lessons learned. And let it guide how we move forward, both in our understanding of history and in the choices we make every day. History does not belong to papers or archives alone. It belongs to memory, to reflection, and to the commitment we make to do better. As we close today's episode, I want to take a moment to hear from you, our listeners. If you have stories you'd like to share, stories of encounters with government secrecy, strange or unexplained events, or experiences that made you question what's really going on behind the scenes, I would love to hear them. You can submit your stories to hexes, haunts, and howls at gmail.com. Again, that's hexes, haunts, and howls, all one word, at gmail.com. Remember, all stories will remain anonymous. Your experiences, your voice, your perspective matter, and sharing them here helps keep this community thoughtful, curious, and safe. Thank you for listening to today's dive deep into MKUltra. It's heavy material, and I hope you took the time to reflect on it. On consent, on care, on memory, and on the human stories that are too often lost in the footnotes of history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history, ethics, and humanity. This has been Hexes, Haunts, and Howls. I'm your host, Cupcake. Until next time, stay sweet.